I've got a couple of pages here in which I'm going to finish, in a sense, the what post-Christianity is and the extent to which it's Christian and the extent to which it's post, if you like. The years 2014 to 2017, you were there, I expect. Well, actually, one of us wasn't, but everybody else was. Were a period of like what would have felt like very sudden developments. And one of the things that motivated me to first start speaking, and by the way, we can circulate the slides. So for those of you who are taking pictures, we can do that. I just need to delete 2 of them first because they don't belong to me. And so I've said I won't circulate them for others. I'll use them in my own preaching, but I'm not going to let... once I've done that, Tim can send them around if that's helpful. But the sudden developments in 2014 to 2017, it was those 3 years I pick as a particularly acute period of lots of things changing. Obviously, 2020, lots of things came to a head, again, in large part, I would say, under the influence of COVID and the lockdowns. But in 2014 to 2017, we had what felt like a very sudden shift, or many people felt it as a very sudden shift in Western culture, which, as I'll show in a moment, I don't think was anything like as sudden as it felt like it was. It just was triggered by a number of sort of world events which made it feel like the world is falling out from under us. And I found that less true in Britain in some ways, because I think Britain's felt post-Christian for longer. I found in North America, most North Americans I speak to, it feels like we've had what took 70 years in Europe in 7 years in America. And it was much more of a shock to people. But I think it still disoriented a lot of people that we serve and reach. Some people in our churches are still trying to get their heads around it. So you have the first gay marriage in 2014. Do you remember ISIS? Do you remember them? Wow, gosh. I mean, that was just like, that was all you could think about in the news for a couple of years, wasn't it? Proclaims the caliphate, then you have the death of Eric Garner, the death of Mike Brown, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Ferguson riots. The Scottish independence referendum in Britain was quite, you just thought, it might not be a Britain next year. It kind of was actually quite an important, turbulent moment, the death of Tamir Rice. I put in some of the death of these black men because they were quite significant to what eventually comes through in 2020 and so on for us. The Charlie Hebdo attack, the Islam versus free speech debates. So there was a lot happening in 2014 to early 2015. Then the Supreme Court rules on Obergefell versus Hodges in North America, which obviously legalizes gay marriage. And then no sooner as that happened, within a month, you have Bruce/Caitlyn Jenner on the front cover of Vogue. So it's like gay rights is done now, and now it's trans. And you could just see, if you just watch the newspapers in that 3-month window, you think, wow, this is very clearly, we've done this, tick, we've done this, tick, next stop, whatever it is, euthanasia, but it'll just be one by one these things, and that's often what felt like it was happening. And to be alive and to be a reflective adult or pastor during that period was to think, wow, this is just, we are up against it here, because one by one, the things that we care about, the Christian legacy I've talked about, is being just unpicked one at a time. That's what I felt. And when you're in those seasons, it feels like it's inevitable progress. It feels like this will just keep going. And of course, that's not how it played out over the next 10 years, but it felt like it at the time. The migrant crisis in Europe following the collapse of Syria was massive for, obviously, politics in this country. It was massive for people who lived there, of course, but as it had a massive impact on lots of other things that wouldn't apparently seem to have anything to do with Syria. But it was a very important moment in what would unfold in the next few years in Britain. Then, of course, the Brexit referendum. Obama's gender identity guidance issued in 2016. Philando Castile is killed. Donald Trump is elected. The Berkeley riots, the launch of Antifa, people literally, masked men occupying downtown cities in America and making them no-go zones, all that sort of thing. The Charlottesville incident in which Trump said there are fine people on both sides with all the kind of people dressed as Klansmen, that kind of thing. So it's really, really febrile, turning the dial up in terms of the intensity of public discourse. And then the start of the Me Too movement. And so in that 3-year, which obviously was very significant and remains in many ways so. So in that 3-year period, it feels like an enormous amount is changing and has changed. That if you went to sleep in 2013 and woke up in summer 2017, you think, what on earth have I missed? Like, this is, the world feels like quite a different, but the Western world, and probably the more socioeconomic, the higher up the socioeconomic tree you are, the more it probably feels like it's changed, I expect. And I sometimes like to call it the Nicky Morgan phenomenon, named after the former British Education Secretary who opposed gay marriage in 2013, decided she was for it in 2014, and saw opposition to it as possible evidence of extremism by 2015. Which is a cheap shot, but it actually reveals how quickly what seem like quite established social norms can change under large public pressure. And obviously that's not the last time we've seen it. We've actually seen in the opposite direction, we've seen a very fascinating shift in a much more influential person than Nicky Morgan, namely Mark Zuckerberg, in the last 12 months. Right? You just think he's heading not on that issue, but in the opposite direction, and you think, wow, these things do. If there is a lot of public pressure and a lot of the line, unfortunately it's a cynic's line, but it's true, Upton Sinclair's line, it is very difficult to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on him not understanding it. And that's what happens. The money does talk, and then suddenly you think, wow, and these people heading in opposite direction. And so it felt like very, very sudden, but it's a sudden development that's centuries in the making, and this is the both and I'm wanting to highlight. It is the fruit of Christian theology, and it's the result of modernist atheism at the same time. And obviously, depending on your disposition and who you're talking to, you might want to emphasize one or other of that. I've found that generally more left-leaning people in the church will celebrate the fruits of Christian theology. So, for instance, it's brilliant. We've got universal healthcare as a result of Christianity. More right-leaning conservative people, and obviously it's more true in America, will see a lot of the developments I just mentioned more as a result of modernist atheism. And it's actually both. And I don't mean to be and therefore we should all be centrist dads, although I am both centrist and a dad. But those two prongs actually shape a lot of these developments. I just want to quickly sketch how Christianity has a built-in moral imperative towards emancipation, freedom. The Exodus story is utterly central to Israel and to the church. Freedom for captives, dignity for the downtrodden, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. He has thrown down the mighty from their seat and exalted the humble and meek. He made himself nothing, taking the form of a slave, and humbled himself to death on a cross. We know this, but this is not an incidental feature of Christianity. It's at the very heart of what the gospel is, of how the incarnation is presented, of how the cross is presented, and how the Exodus story works. And so obviously, people who marinate in that story for 3,000 years do end up with an inbuilt desire, or should end up with an inbuilt desire to say, if there is somebody around here who is, as a result of circumstances, has been marginalised, oppressed, downtrodden, crushed, opposed, God's heart is to lift that person up. And if there are people here who are high, exalted, proud, rich, prosperous, and reveling in many ways, actually built on the back of the misfortunes and oppressions of other people, they should be brought down. And that is just a Christian idea. That's not a lefty idea, although it now sounds like one to many people, but it isn't. It's just that's how Christianity thinks. That's how Christians have always thought and practiced. Jürgen Habermas, a critical theorist and German philosopher, and not in any way an evangelical Christian, I think it's fair to say. Sorry, this is going to sound like gobbledygook because it's very wordy, but this is how German philosophers talk. For the normative self-understanding of modernity, Christianity has functioned as more than just a precursor or a catalyst. Universalistic egalitarianism, from which sprang the ideals of freedom and a collective life in solidarity, the autonomous conduct of life, emancipation, the individual morality of conscience, human rights, and democracy, all of those things, is the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the subject of a continual critical reappropriation and reinterpretation. Up to this day, there is no alternative to it. In other words, Western people believe in all of those things because of the Jewish emphasis on justice and the Christian ethic of love. And that's just who we are. And this is from a guy who does not believe the gospel, as far as I know, he's in his 90s now, at all. But he's one of the most brilliant philosophers to have been working in the West in the last 100 years. And he's like, this is just where they come from. That doesn't mean that we're wrong to believe them or right to believe them. That's their genealogy. That is where they come from. So I think that's just... I personally think it's undeniably true. And as I said, someone like Tom Holland would be much more well known now than he was when I originally wrote some of these things through the influence of his podcast. But this is his thing and has been now for quite a long time, and he's not the only one doing it. But it's also the result of a lot of those changes we just looked at on the previous page are also the result of modernist atheism. Right? You trace it back to the three major idols of human history and the three founding fathers of modernism who correspond to them: money, sex, and power. Let's just say that Marx is all about money, Freud's all about sex, Nietzsche's all about power. It's not as simple as that, but let's assume it was. So there is a Marxist line here. The world is divided into oppressors. Everybody is either exploiter or exploited. Oppressed peoples are called to unite, revolt against the oppressors, and in the 20th century it shifts. So instead of liberating people who genuinely have nothing, it begins to shift and become translated through, because the revolution doesn't work, it then gets translated into cultural kinds of oppression. And so it obviously enters straight, not just money, but enters out into sex and all sorts of other categories as well. Freud, the suppression of sexual urges causes social problems, so virtually all sexual taboos are transgressed, because the reason you're sad is because you want to do something sexually that you don't do. So you've got to violate taboos to mean that people can become happier. And if a sexual restraint causes you a therapeutic problem, then the sexual restraint has to go, which obviously is a big part of the sexual revolution to the degree we experience it in the last 60 odd years. And that includes now, well beyond what Freud would have thought, or even people in the 60s would have thought, but includes the removal of, because biological sex itself might be a constraint on your sexual flourishing. So we jettison that and say, no, biological sex is just contract, it doesn't matter. And then power. Humans are motivated by the will to power, and over the 20th century that kind of morphs into the idea that power is the essential feature of all human relationships. So any truth claim by a person like many of us, or any of us, certainly if you stand up as a pastor and preach something, it's like, this is just a claim to power. That's all you're doing. The only way you can really know stuff might be scientific, but if you stand up and make any transcendental truth claim, you're just looking for power over me. How dare you say that as a ... You can't speak to my lived experience because you are a ... You think that it's assuming a model of all human place to truth being essentially about desiring power over another person. And of course, lots of human relationships do involve getting power over people, and many people leverage that for bad ends, including people who do what I and many of us do, which makes it complicated. You can't just say, there's nothing to see here. No, powerful white men have never exploited other people. You think, that's not going to wash. But that doesn't mean that all human relations are only about power, and it also doesn't mean you can't speak truth, which is designed to emancipate people, because the truth will set you free. The truth will not put you in chains. So that, and this tension between these two shapes a lot of the developments that we saw in the previous page, I think. Anybody want to comment on that or ask a question on it? Okay, that looks like a no. Right, I'm going to skip the next page because this I included in my this is my book in one page, but I'm just going to ignore that for now. Okay? It's still in the presentation. That is a book I might like to write in one page. Who was there in 1960? Who remembers 1968? Yeah. It's funny how people just put up their hands much less high. They don't admit their age, but they're just like, no, this is my so I wrote a book on the transformations of 1776, and I have got percolating the idea to write another one on 1968, because I just think it's actually very analogous to what is even happening in the West in the last year, in that sometimes what happens is you end up with years of very take to the streets public protest and revolution, which looks like it is going to generate a new kind of, the kingdom is here kind of thing. But actually what often happens is it quickly turns into reaction, and it ends up benefiting what it looks like a progressive movement that ends up generating a much more conservative response, and leaves the overall norm of the nation to the right of where it was before the revolution happened, which is obviously to some degree what is happening at the moment in the West, in all kinds of different countries. I was just in Vienna last week seeing it happen, talking about that with an Austrian MP actually, on a panel, and seeing how that's happening in Central Europe. It's obviously happened in France, it's obviously happened to some degree in Britain, it's definitely happened in America. And 1968 is just a really fascinating example, because you have all the, a lot of these protest movements taking place, these famous things, and obviously, Black Power and famous debates, but you also have, hat tip to Birmingham, Enoch Powell making an appearance, Charles de Gaulle, Richard Nixon, and you think actually after 1968, the Republicans were in power for 20 of the next 24 years after all these protests. It's just fascinating. So, and in some ways, you end up seeing some of that take place in the West right now. It's like a kind of reliving of that year. And I think probably the 2014 to 17 changes I sketched a moment ago, and coming to a head in many ways in 2020, you end up seeing what often happens is you can call it a backlash, and in some ways, of course, it is, but it's sometimes a bit more complicated than just a backlash, but actually embeds more conservative norms. Anyway, I'll throw that out there, but that was just for fun. Tim, could we play that video? We're now going to start to talk about how we engage with people, and how how a lot of this stuff is not just, I hope not just theory, but it can really help us engage. And I'm going to start by showing a 3-minute video that Glenn Scrivener will be a name known to some of you. He's actually basically a neighbour of mine. I'm a big fan of Glenn. And he's written a super book on some of this stuff called The Air We Breathe, which is basically for the people who don't want to read Tom Holland's Dominion but like the idea, and it's like he would say it's Holland for dummies. That's his words, not mine. But this video is just a really great 3-minute video with puppets or cartoons explaining. Suddenly people go, oh, I might watch it then. I just think it's a really good example of how to use some of what I'm saying in evangelism.
This is Sally. Sally is a rational person who could never make a leap of faith like Robbie up there. Look at Robbie. He's a faith head, floating around, unsupported by anything. No, Sally simply goes by the evidence and the assured findings of science and reason. I mean, obviously Sally believes that all people are equal. That's just normal. And that society must protect its weakest members, obviously. She is certain that consent is essential to sex, and that education, not coercion, is the path to enlightenment. She trusts science and what it can deliver the world. She is certain that all people should be free, and she's concerned to reform the evils of yesterday as we progress to a brighter tomorrow. Oh, hey, Robbie, what are you doing down here? That's right. Sally is a believer. Because none of these morals, assumptions, or deep intuitions are the result of logic or scientific experiments. You can't prove equality, compassion, consent, or any of these values that we live by every day. We believe in these values. We stake our lives on them. But they're not the kinds of things you can deduce logically or demonstrate scientifically. It turns out that Sally is a believer. She doesn't need to make a leap of faith. She's already living at a great height. Day by day, minute by minute, she assumes any number of values that cannot be proven with mathematical certainty. The solid ground she thinks she's standing on is not the ground of simple logic or reason. Actually, the values she lives by are founded on something else, something she might not have considered. And without that foundation, the values she lives by don't really make sense. You see, Sally lives her life based on the values of the Jesus Revolution. She doesn't know that's where her values have come from. She's never been to church. She's never read the Bible for herself. But she's grown up in a culture built by Jesus and the values he has injected into the world. Sally has been assuming some deeply Christian truths all along, even if she never really examined them. But if she takes the time to look where she's standing, she might just find that she's more of a person of faith than she thought. Sally's challenge is not to take a leap of faith. Through the Jesus Revolution, history has already taken an almighty leap. Sally, along with the rest of us, are already in midair. What she needs is some ground beneath her feet, and it's Jesus alone who can provide it. That's the argument of The Air We Breathe. It charts the advance of the Jesus Revolution from Genesis to the modern day and from equality to progress. It's for the Robbies of the world who are happy to be known as believers. And it's for the Sallys too, for those who thought that they were incapable of faith. It turns out that through Jesus and the growth of his movement, beliefs are far more common than we think. They are the air we breathe.
But I really love it. I just think it's a great, partly, there's cartoons and puppets, so what's not to like, but I just think it expresses the idea very, very well. And so back to the comment I made at the start, it's much easier to say to somebody, this is what you believe and here's why you're right, than this is what you believe and here's why you're wrong. Which only works if people do believe those things. But most people, so when we're interacting with post-Christians, most people do. And that can be a real help. So I want to pause here and just sort of, any kind of questions or comments on anything that we've done in this session up to now? Anybody, kind of how this works, or any kind of questions about how it would interact with different kinds of groups of people in society? That looks like a... Did I see that hand?
Yeah, you saw that.
I feel like a bingo caller.
I'm just processing the question in my head. What would be the counter arguments that somebody might put up against this view?
Depends who they are. I think there would be... So I think the highest level response would probably be to say that there are signs of some of these things in some other cultures that don't seem to have come from Christianity. And so I think that probably the religious group that's got the best claim to be able to see a couple of these things in their culture is Buddhism, I think. So if you were in particularly if you were in a quite literate, educated, graduate-y community of Buddhists, they would probably say, no, lots of these things are part of our tradition too, and we didn't get them from Christianity. And there's probably there is a bit of truth to that, in the sense that obviously not these things are sort of, they've come into the West through the Jesus Revolution, but I don't think it's not like the common grace still exists, and there's still shadows of lots of those things in other settings. What I think the argument I then make back is to say that the universality of those values is not apparent in those religions. So the idea that these things exist, yes, because obviously lots of families operate with those kinds of things themselves. Christians are not the only people who think that consent is important in a sexual relationship. But the idea that that is a universal value is a very Christian idea. So the idea that the distinction I'm making, like, this is how we do it, fine. This is how everybody must do it, and if they don't, they are immoral. That's a Christian idea, I think. And that kind of thing could only really come from the major world religions. So I think that would be one kind of critique you get. I think, to be honest, the much more common critique you'd get is that I didn't get my belief in that from Christianity. To most people, this might just not feel very true to some measure, because they've just, like Sally, they've just think, I concluded this myself. And I didn't get it from, I'm not a Christian. They say, no, but that's not how values are transmuted at all. Values come from, you got this, by the age of 5, some of these things were very apparent to you, even if you'd never rationally thought about them. And so I think there's that. And then I think you'd obviously, in between those, so you've got the sort of, you might have a kind of a Buddhist response, you might have an everyday common sense response, and obviously an evolutionary psychologist would make a response on some of them. Would say, well, some of these things are beneficial to human beings, and as in our desire for, compassion is based on a sense simply that we want other people to show compassion to us. And so someone like Jonathan Haidt, who's a really good evolutionary psychologist who talks about the origin of a lot of our beliefs and is very warm to Christianity, I think he would say you don't have to have Christianity to support all those things, but to also think that he would probably concede again that the universality of those beliefs, the idea that this is how all people should and must think about things, and if they don't, they're not acting morally, is itself Christian. And Richard Dawkins wouldn't go, but Dawkins is fascinating because even recently, this last year, I'm basically a cultural Christian. Now, it's been overread as a comment, but I think he is insane. He's saying, well, I do believe in those things, and yeah, fair enough. I did get them from Christian influence, but I still think Christianity is a load of bunk. So, and I think it's open to anyone to say that, but that isn't actually an objection to Sally. In many ways, or an objection to this video and that way of thinking. What it's really doing is saying, I am choosing arbitrarily to accept the Christian vision of the ethical life without any foundation for it, which of course everyone's entitled to do. But that's why I think our apologetic to such people is, I'm giving you ground for what you're standing on. Like, you want this to be true, and it is true. But at the moment, you don't have any reason to think that it is, and I'm giving you one. But
I don't know if you'd agree, but my observation is that a lot of people wouldn't use the language of universal morality, and there's a contradiction in their own position, because they live and speak and evangelise as if there is a universal and everybody should accept these principles. Yeah. But if you start challenging it and start saying, well, do you actually believe this is a universal principle, and where did you get it from? Oh, no, I wouldn't say it was, I don't know if you agree with that.
True. Well. No, they wouldn't. That's not the language people would use. But I think it's a bit childish. But in some, it depends on the relationship, depends on the person, all that stuff. But I think in some situations you can say, what's the famous? I feel like it might. I feel like it's somebody like Chesterton. Is it Copleston and Russell? There's one of those famous sort of early 20th century debates between a bishop and a skeptic, where the guy says, the skeptic says, I think that ultimately these morals are a matter of preference, and the bishop says, well, in some societies they love their enemies, and in some they eat them. Do you have a preference? And I think at quite a silly level, you can say, do you really think that it is just a preference? because I think you can make that appeal. And obviously, in some cultures, they wouldn't have the same value. They'd say, no, ultimately, I think love your enemies, it's a nice idea, but it doesn't actually reflect the way I want to believe. But I think for most post-Christian people, it does. I think the centrality of something like forgiveness, the fact that people are morally moved, emotionally deeply moved when they see someone who's been victimised forgiving their oppressor, is a very powerful witness to the fact this runs very deep in Western people. So I think they often can see it, and it's not just a preference they have. They actually do believe that you are a better person if you believe it than if you don't. But I'm not saying that people instinctively go, yes, of course, it's a Christian value. They won't. And that's why I like this, because it's quite a sort of round the side, it's kind of a slightly edgy, silly video, childish, and you can just drop it in and get people to think about it. But I think, many of us will use things like Alpha, but I just think sometimes that the kind of questions that people come in with, you can often help to use things like this early on in kind of dialogue with or courses for people who are not Christian and exploring, because it can just slightly undercut some of the objections people have. I think the strongest objection is none of those. The strongest objection is the church. It hasn't lived by those things at all. And I think that, at an emotional level, that's often what people will want to say. But that obviously isn't a rational objection to this. It's a slight change of subject, but that's often where the discussion goes. But that in some ways, I don't see that as an answer to it, as much as I don't like the fact that you haven't lived by it. And I think, well, no, at that point I have to say, fair enough, you're right. Yeah.
I guess looking ahead, you're saying the jury's still quite a bit out as to whether we're going to, as a culture, be content with living with these values without any kind of foundation, or abandoning the values altogether.
Yeah.
Were we to kind of go ahead with abandoning those values, how do you think kind of our interactions with unbelievers and our evangelism would have to shift then?
God.
Proactive.
No. I don't know. I touch on. I asked the first half of that question in my book Remaking the World, which is about all of this. The book on 1776 about all of this. As I say, I think we have I think there are basically three scenarios for the post-Christian West in the next 100 years. But I don't know which one it will take, and I don't know what to do about one of the three scenarios. I'm happy with what to do about the other two. I think scenario number one is that the culture moves, that effectively you pass a tipping point beyond which people say, because we don't believe in these Christian foundations anymore, we are now, quite a large number of people are going to go the way of, to take an easy example, Andrew Tate, who is not the same as Friedrich Nietzsche or the Marquis de Sade or Adolf Hitler, but actually where there is something in common, which is that I'm basically going to try and derive my morality from nature rather than from the cross. Paul Kingsnorth talks about this, the cross and the machine. Like that's really your choice in modern industrial society. So I am going to go, this works, this is the strong eat the weak, and in the end that's what happens. I'm going to function as if evolutionary biology was the only show in town, not Christianity. Therefore, all people are not equal. It's obvious that they're not equal in any sense that measured by size or ability or capacity or whatever. My daughter's heavily disabled. She is not, and therefore I could say, if I held that narrative, just say, she's not as able. She can't achieve the same things that I can. Therefore, she's not worth as much as me. Like, in that worldview, that's what you, and maybe that's what happens. Maybe enough people come to believe that, and the institutional response is so weak that it becomes accepted. I think that's the least likely. That's the apocalyptic scenario. And the only time that's been tried at state level is Nazi Germany. And I think the fact that it was tried at state level and became such a byword for moral evil has left such a deep imprint in the imagination of all Western people. And a number of people have made this point that they're like the most influential moral figure now in the West is not Jesus, it's Adolf Hitler. That you define morality negatively, as in not would Jesus do it, but would Hitler not do it? And seriously, like that's the morals. That's why people call each other fascists so quickly when you get into an argument online, because we don't know how to reason morally, except to say this is not what Hitler would do, and therefore it's probably right. So I think that's extremely unlikely, but in centuries to come it might. If that happens, I don't know what to do. But that's possibility one. That's the really bad one. Possibility two, which is where we are now, and might remain for some time, might be 100 years. T.S. Eliot made this point in his book, like 80, 90 years ago, in The Idea of a Christian Society, where he said basically Christian societies remain Christian in the formal sense until a new ideology emerges to take their place. So you can remain in the twilight of institutional Christianity no longer, but we still hold Christian values like this for a long time, unless there is a new ideology that emerges that rejects Christianity and gives a new moral framework. But that would have to be very compelling, and it might take a long time. And if you think the ancient worldview of pagan Greeks took lasted for hundreds of years after it had got any sort of lost its intellectual impulse, but it remained a long time until Christianity came. And the only time that's come about, the great example of that would of course be Islam, where eventually a new ideology did come and replace what Christians believed in large parts of what's now the Middle East. So that might happen. It might be another world religion springs up out of somewhere and at the time really Islam was a sort of sectarian, it was almost a very sectarian form of Christianity. Personally, it would be my read of what happened early on. And then the third possibility is religious revival, that people do come back to Jesus, and the prodigal who's eating his pig husks and eventually concludes, yeah, this is not working, I will arise and go to my father. And he comes back and finds his father's ready to welcome him, and that's where the church stands ready to receive what I've heard described as refugees from the sexual revolution, where their nations collapsed and they've gone, okay, I need to come back. Which of those three happens, I don't know. I'm obviously really hope it's not the first one, and I really hope it is the last one. But at the moment we're in the middle. And we shall see.
And why do you think there are these reactions back to conservative? What's the impulse behind that?
I think it heavily depends on the culture and the nation. And I think it's I would feel out of my depth, to be honest, pontificating on it at a general level. I think the two cultures I know the most about would be, North America and Britain, obviously, where if I just backpedal a moment, so I'm not going to make everything about this, don't worry, but I actually think it does give us quite a good example of the way of how it looked. It's easier to see it when it happened 60 years ago than when it's happening now. But what happens is, this is just, some of us, we remember it, and others are going, who on earth are these people? But basically, you end up with people with lots of large-scale change and sort of when economic uncertainty kicks in, there's often not just people feel unstable, but you end up with people, you have too many people who are overqualified for what they want to do, and don't get the jobs that they want, and in the end they get frustrated and they start protesting and they start objecting to, and you often get in the West, it's been students, and it's happened in many of these pictures, and they take to the streets and they behave in such a way that the normies, everybody else, looks at them and goes, oh my goodness. I mean, I personally think they have a point with some of what they're saying, but what a load of nonsense. This is just absolute lunacy. These people in 1968 smoking weed, lying around naked in parks in San Francisco, we can't have that. Let's just get someone in who's going to come and sort it out. Mingled with the racial backlash which was taking place in America at the time because of the civil rights movement, and you end up with lots of sort of people who feel like their way of life has been threatened are now being whatever, black people have got all these rights they didn't used to have, and so on, a little bit on. So you end up with a bad bit of conservatism, a racist bit, mingled with a sort of backlash against the excessive overreach of the progressive movement, and they go, all right, well, Nixon's saying law and order, and it's a bit of a dog whistle on all. Okay, well let's get him in, and it kind of. And then Jimmy Carter was unfortunate with the economy, really, and so it gets embedded over the whole of the 80s as well. So I think that's kind of, it's like, and I think you get a similar thing in Britain. I think the destabilisation of the Middle East in the last 15 years and the consequent migration to Britain has meant that a lot of people are reacting to a political moment, in part, but some of it is racist and some of it is whatever, but some of it's not. Some of it's based on economics and some of it's based on political overreach by their opponents, and I think that's some of what's happened in the last 5 years as well. But I'm not saying that's true. That certainly wouldn't be the diagnosis we would all share. I know that. It's not in the Bible. And I also don't think it would be necessarily a fair reading of what's happening in all Western countries anyway. I just think it's probably the way I would account for what's happening in Britain and the US. So yeah, but obviously that's a very contested thing, because if you're a conservative, you will emphasise the good bit of that story and not the bad bit, and progressive will do the other. So some people say it's all because of racism, and some people say it's all because of progressive overreach. And I think it's probably both of them are mixed up, at least in the last 50 years, I would say. Gosh, there's hot potatoes being thrown in here, so thank you. Yes, sir.
Can I ask, Can I ask two questions that are really related? One is just, do you think things are becoming increasingly political? So as we talk about some of these things in terms of values, post-Christian values, but the way they need to be expressed within the culture is politically, and therefore stuff like Brexit became a huge issue in churches in a way that politics maybe hadn't quite.
Yes. Yeah, I can see that.
So, politicisation and seeing values expressed. And then secondly, how do we respond to that? Some of us might be in churches where we're expected to preach or feel a pressure to preach very directly to align politically in some way. Yeah. Some of us react to that and go, I'm not going to go anywhere near any of this stuff politically because I'm just going to be misheard or misinterpreted. But just like, what's your sense on how we respond in our preaching that is neither just weak and totally apolitical, but is very careful about how we navigate these issues politically?
That's great questions. Okay, yes to the first question. I do think, I think the reason why society now is more politicised, I think there are two factors, but the main one is that people's identity which would normally be provided by something like nation, religion, family, individualism undercuts all of those things. People, even class identity is weak for most people. That's not where they find their solid. They might say I am certain middle class, working class, but they don't. That's not where they derive their sense of meaning. For most people, derive their sense of meaning. And so what happens is political affiliation, particularly for middle class and graduate types who write all the newspapers and all the social media sites and code and everything, becomes the main way that they can identify with something larger than themselves. And human beings need to do that, but late modern individualism has cut almost all of those sources of collective solidarity from us, and therefore we have to find it somewhere. So we find it with like-minded politicos who we don't even meet, we just bond online. And so I think much of it is caused by that. So people's political tribe, so there's interesting research they do now where they say that people are most people in America, they do lots of research on it, but people are more nervous about having their kid marrying a Republican than they are about their kid marrying someone of a different ethnic group or religion. So like the political alignment is now tighter than their alignment to religion or, that's true. I did that one, but it's true in reverse, right? Republican parents would be more nervous about their child bringing home a Democrat than bringing home a person of another kind of tribal identity. And that is, that just shows how far it's gone. So I think that's a big factor. But I do think there are other sort of more, like low-key technological factors which make it possible to bond over. I think social media is an obvious example. That mean you can, if you want to, live in a world surrounded by people who share your politics, because you're not really interacting with real people at all. You don't even buy things from real people. Someone turns up at your door and walks off. So, but seriously, so it means you can curate. If you're more affluent or graduate, you will curate your own bubble. And this is more true amongst graduates, I would say. So that's what we do about it. I think in preaching, how much faith do you have to take these things on? I think the thing is there are so many subjects that you don't have to preach in a political way, but which we must address, which will sound political to some people, but which you don't have to do that way, that I don't actually ever really need to preach a sermon on, quote, politics, unless I'm preaching through Romans and I come to chapter 13 and it talks about how you relate to Caesar. At which point I have to talk about politics, but I'm talking about politics in the sense of the powers of the world and how we interact with them, rather than which party you should. I would never go, this is the party you vote for, this is what. So I tend to do a lot of it. I quite enjoy, because I find, I find it really stimulating to engage people in thinking about how the gospel applies to issues, but I wouldn't never do it through a party political lens. And so we would talk about issues that, I'm just in the next couple of weeks going to be doing some stuff on technologies, a series on technology, so we're going to touch on, end of life and beginning of life, medical ethics, all those sorts of things. Are they political issues? Well, they're issues on which Christians should have a view, and they're issues on which I actually think the Bible's fairly clear. And they are also issues that in some countries are politicised, but by God's grace in Britain they're not really, because your local MP might believe something very different from what their party does on all of them, and that's okay here, in a way that I would have a much bigger problem with doing that if I lived in North America, because they are part of political platforms, they're not here. So is that a political issue? Well, maybe, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. but I'm probably not going to do that in the run-up to an election. Or if I'm going to talk about something in an election because there's a big justice issue at stake, I'm going to talk about the issue and not the party side. But I have often said to my American friend, I've got obviously spent a lot of time preaching, teaching in America, and know a lot of. I would just like. I think it is much harder now to be a pastor in America than it is in Britain, because those dynamics you're managing are very different. Whereas here, I think it's still pretty straightforward to go. We're going to talk about this issue today, and people aren't going to go, "You raging whatever." I mean, I did actually preach on. I just addressed the Brexit referendum. We didn't call it Brexit back then. We did a series called Citizens. We did a whole series of different things, and we actually looked at the referendum. But again, I talked about what a Christian view of immigration should be, but I'd say this is what you should vote on the referendum. So that's how and that was 10 years ago. So that's what I would do. If the Bible talks about it, we should talk about it. Don't be afraid of it, but don't. But if you package them politically, people will feel you're getting at them. So. Okay, I think we have another 10-minute break. Is that right?
Yes.